בנושא מדיניות האיחוד האירופי, בנושא בינה מלאכותית. שמי נטע בראל, אני נספחת המסחרית לאיחוד האירופי מטעם משרד הכלכלה והתעשייה. לפני שנתחיל אני אציין שהוובינר תחילתו תהיה בעברית, ולאחר מכן נעבור לאנגלית להרצאה המרכזית ולסשן השאלות והתשובות. כמו כן הוובינר מוקלט ונשלח לכל הנרשמים את המצגות שהוצגו במהלכו. הוובינר היום הוא יוזמה משותפת של הנספחות המסחרית של משרד הכלכלה והתעשייה לאיחוד האירופי ורשות החדשנות הישראלית במשרד המדע. בעוד מספר דקות אנחנו נשמע הרצאה ממומחית מטעם הנציבות של האיחוד האירופי בנושא האסטרטגיית הבינה המלאכותית החדשה של האיחוד. לפני כן נספר לכם בקצרה על עבודת הנספחות המסחרית בבריסל והנושאים שאנחנו עובדים עליהם. ראשית, אשמח לתת את הבמה ללנה זייגר, מנהלת מחלקת הסכמי סחר בילטראליים במינהל סחר חוץ, משרד הכלכלה והתעשייה, לשאת דברי ברכה. לנה, בבקשה.
תודה רבה נטע, וצהריים טובים לכולם. אני מאוד שמחה לפתוח את הסמינר הזה. זה נושא חשוב מאוד ודינמי מאוד. הנושא של בעבודה שלנו בזירה הבינלאומית אנחנו רואים שטכנולוגיות מתעוררות ובינה מלאכותית בפרט זה באמת אחד הנושאים החמים גם בתחום עיצוב המדיניות נקרא לזה, ומדינות רואות בכך משמעות כלכלית ומשמעות אפילו גיאופוליטית, ואנחנו באמת בזירות רבות רואים התפתחויות ומאמצים של מדינות ליצור סביבה מאפשרת ולעודד בעצם לתמרץ נניח תחר פיתוח בתחום, וגם עבודה למשל בזירות בינלאומיות על התפתחויות רגולטוריות וחשיבה גם מהזוויות, נניח זוויות אתיות וכולי, ועד כמה ובאיזה אופן הממשלות צריכות להתוות את הדרך או את כללי המשחק. ואנחנו בעצם במינהל סחר חוץ, העבודה שלנו, שאני מקווה שאתם מכירים אותנו ועובדים, אבל בקצרה רק לומר, המטרה זה לקדם ייצוא, לסייע לחברות ישראליות לגשת לשווקים הזרים, וגם למשוך השקעות, באמצעות רשת של נספחים מסחריים, והפוקוס שלנו במחלקה, אני מדברת על מחלקה שאני מובילה, של מדיניות סחר והסכמים שאחראים על אירופה, וכמובן הנספחות שלנו, הנספחות הכלכלית בבריסל, אנחנו עובדים לקדם ולייצג את האינטרסים הישראלים מול הנציבות האירופית, וכמובן גם ברמה לאומית, וגם מאוד 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 משתדלים בין היתר בסמינרים כמו זה, להביא לכם את המידע העדכני על התפתחויות, ומה שחשוב לי לומר האיזון החוזר מכם מאוד משמעותי, אז א', תודה שהצטרפתם, וב', באמת להזמין אתכם להיות איתנו בקשר, כמובן עם נטע והצוות שלה, וגם אנחנו פה בירושלים, אנחנו ממש לרשותכם, ואנחנו נשמח מאוד לשמוע וביחד איתכם לנתח את ההזדמנויות, וגם אולי את האתגרים שיש עבור חברות ישראליות, לאור ההתפתחויות, למשל התפתחויות רגולטוריות, אבל גם כל נושא אחר שאתם רואים לנכון להציב בפנינו, בזירה הבינלאומית וספציפית באירופה. תודה.
תודה רבה לנה. עכשיו אני אציג לכם בקצרה קצת על מה אנחנו פה בבריסל בנספחות המסחרית עושים, ולאחר מכן נעבור להרצאה המרכזית. אז הנספחות הכלכלית והמסחרית של ישראל לאיחוד האירופי, אנחנו יושבים בבריסל, בלגיה. אנחנו חלק ממערך של כמעט 45 נספחויות כלכליות ברחבי העולם, שפורסות בכל היבשות, אשר עוסקות בצורה זו או אחרת בלסייע לתעשייה. מרבית הנספחויות המסחריות בעצם מסייעות לתעשייה באמצעות איתור מפיצים, איתור לקוחות, סיוע מול גורמי ממשל מקומיים וכן הלאה. אנחנו בנספחות המסחרית פה בבריסל עוסקים בעבודה מול האיחוד האירופי, ולכן יש לה אופי מעט שונה, שאני מיד אכנס לזה. אז קודם כל לציין שאנחנו אחראים על כל קשרי הכלכלה והמסחר עם המוסדות של האיחוד האירופי, גם עם נציבות האיחוד האירופי, גם עם המועצה שמייצגת את המדינות החברות וגם עם הפרלמנט של האיחוד האירופי, ואנחנו אחראים על קידום יחסי המסחר והמו"פ עם האיחוד עצמו. אנחנו מתאמים את הפעילויות שלנו במספר תחומים וסקטורים בהתאם לצרכים של התעשייה הישראלית. אני מיד אתן מספר דוגמאות גם לסוג הפעילויות שאנחנו מבצעים. עיקר העבודה שלנו הוא מעקב אחר יוזמות חקיקה ורגולציה של האיחוד, שעלולה להיות להם השפעה על התעשייה הישראלית, או שיש להם השפעה על התעשייה הישראלית. אם מדובר ביוזמות, אנחנו מנסים גם לעשות עבודת לובינג כדי להשפיע על עיצוב אותם יוזמות, כמו היוזמה שתוצג היום פה בהמשך הוובינר, ולפעמים אנחנו גם מסייעים לחברות בפתרון של בעיות ספציפיות, שעולות במקרה של רגולציות מסוימות, להבין איך עליהן להישמע לאותן רגולציה, כדי לוודא שהעיצוב שלהם והעבודה שלהם פה באיחוד תעשה בצורה טובה. אז כפי שאמרתי, אנחנו עושים ניתוח רגולטורי, אנחנו ממש עוברים רגולציות חדשות ומנסים להפוך אותם למעט יותר פשוטות, כדי שהתעשיינים והחברות הישראליות יוכלו להבין מה בעצם הדרישות מהם. מדובר לרוב במסמכים מאוד מאוד ארוכים, ואנחנו מנסים לפשט אותם עבור התעשייה הישראלית, כמו שאנחנו עושים כיום בוובינר הזה. דוגמאות לתחומים שאנחנו מתעסקים בהם, אז ציוד רפואי, כלכלה מעגלית, שהוא תחום מאוד מאוד משמעותי כיום באיחוד האירופי, כל התחום הסביבתי, הגרין דיל האירופי הוא חלק מאוד משמעותי מהעבודה שלנו. בנושא מע"מ, בכל הנוגע לסחר מקוון, מוצרי צריכה, כימיקלים, שענף ייצור מאוד משמעותי של ישראל. לעתים אנחנו נתקלים בבעיות של חברות ישראליות בנמלים במדינות החברות עצמם, אנחנו עובדים יחד עם הנציגים שלנו באותן מדינות, כדי לנסות לפתור בעיות ספציפיות, אם זה מוצרים שמורכבים, רגולציות שלא נרשמו כמו שצריך בתפסי היבוא, כל מיני בעיות שיכולות לעלות בנמלים עצמם, ואנחנו מנסים לסייע ולפשט מול הגורמים פה בבריסל ומול הגורמים הרגולטוריים בתוך המדינות החברות עצמם. לפעמים אנחנו גם עובדים מול הגופים בתוך המוסדות של האיחוד האירופי בפתרון נושאי מדיניות שהם אחראים עליהם, שיכולים להוות חסמי סחר לחברות ישראליות. ובמידת הצורך, כפי שציינתי, אנחנו מבצעים גם פעילות לובי כדי להשפיע על אישורים של מוצרים מסוימים, בדוגמה של כימיקלים, כאשר אנחנו מנסים להשפיע על אישור של כימיקל מסוים שיאושר למטרות רחבות יותר, כדי שחברות ישראליות יוכלו להמשיך ולייצר אותו לתוך האיחוד. במקביל, אנחנו גם, היה לנו הרבה עבודה בתחילת משבר הקורונה, על מתן אישורי ייצוא עבור ייצוא של מוצרים לצרכים רפואיים בישראל, וככל שיהיה צורך אנחנו נמשיך ונעסוק בנושאים כאלה גם בעתיד. בעצם הסכם הסחר שבין ישראל לאיחוד האירופי הוא בעצם מה שמסדיר את העבודה שלנו מול האיחוד, ואנחנו מקיימים גם הרבה עבודה על ההשפעות המדיניות של ההסכם סחר הזה, ולצערנו לפעמים מתעסקים גם בנושא האלה. זה בקצרה, כאן יש לכם את האימייל שלנו שאתם יכולים לפנות אלינו, ואם יש לכם בעיות או שאלות אנחנו נשמח לעמוד לרשותכם. בנוסף קיימת מערכת הפניות שלנו, ה-ERM של מינהל סחר חוץ, דרכה אפשר לפנות לכל הנספחויות המסחריות, ואני עכשיו אעבור לאנגלית ואציג את הדוברת שלנו, אשר תעביר לנו את ההרצאה המרכזית שלנו להיום. So I'm switching to English now, and I'd like to move on to the second part of our webinar. And I'd like to present our keynote speaker, Ms. Irina Orssich. Ms. Orssich has been working for the European Commission at the Director General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology, which is called DG Connect. She's the head of sector for artificial intelligence policy. Her responsibilities include ethical and regulatory aspects of artificial intelligence. Ms. Orssich is a German national, has a law degree and postgraduate degree in European law, and her previous responsibilities have included posts in the audiovisual sector and as a legal advisor for competition and state aid law. Ms. Orssich, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here and to present you our AI Act. Actually, I'm even more curious to know what you listened to before, but I just start presenting you what we are doing, and I'm also greatly looking forward to your questions. So you should now see my screen well. I start with a bit of history. Well, I would start if the slide was moving, which it isn't. Now it is, yes. So we started our work on artificial intelligence with the European Commission actually a long time ago. Well, a long time, it depends on how you calculate it. In 2004, we started doing and supporting research on artificial intelligence. And quite some of you might have been involved in the one or the other research project. Now, it became more political in 2018, and then we started with our first European strategy on AI in April, which is based on 3 pillars: the economic and competitiveness innovation side, the legal and ethical side, and then also the socio-economic side, where in particular we were asking the questions on the future of work. From there, we continued working, putting together a high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, and they were discussing and drafting ethical principle for trustworthy AI and also an online assessment tool. And in the same time, we also did something we call a coordinated plan on AI. Together with our 27 member states, we discussed all kinds of possible measures to promote artificial intelligence, to support artificial intelligence, what we can do together, what we can do individually, how we can do strategies, and that we adopted in December 2018. Then in February 2020, we came forward with a white paper. That was against the background that our new president of the European Commission had promised to the European Parliament when she was still president-elect that within 100 days after starting her mandate, she would put forward a law on the legal and ethical implications of artificial intelligence. Now, 100 days to draft a complete law was very ambitious, but what we put then forward in 2020 was the white paper. And there you can see that we always consider trust, so the legal side, and excellence, so the economic side, as 2 sides of the same coin. And we believe that the 2 of them cannot go without each other. So a white paper in our terms is a document which is there for consultation. We had presented a number of options, what we could do in terms of legal framework, in terms of support. That was broadly consulted. We had more than 1,500 submissions to an online questionnaire and more than 400 PDF position documents. This, by Brussels European standards, is quite a lot, and based actually on these submissions, but also on all kinds of studies and impact assessment discussions we had, we came forward in April 21, so a good year ago, with the AI package. There we have a communication, we have a review of the coordinated plan, and we have the proposal for the Artificial Intelligence Act. Now, just one slide quickly on the coordinated plan. What we are doing, we are trying to set the enabling conditions. So this is about policies and strategies. It is about data. It is about computing capacity. Then we have a lot of research. We have We have different tools to try to get the research into the market and also in particular to help SMEs. And we have funding. Then we have something we call ensure AI technologies work for people. They're very important talent and skills, something we are desperately missing. The ethical and legal framework, but also a chapter on the international, where we foresee all kinds of cooperations, joint standard makings, bilaterally, multilaterally. And finally, and that was the novelty, we have a part where we have sectors where we believe that things should be done. So for example, climate and environment, health, we have the public sector, law enforcement, agriculture, mobility, and we have a strategy on robotics and the public sector. With that, I leave the coordinated plan and I go to the regulation. So I will give you an overview about the regulation. You need to know, in terms of our procedures, the Commission proposes something, proposes a legal act, and that then goes to the co-legislators, the European Parliament and the member states in the European Council. These two need to adopt a position, and once they have adopted their positions, there is the so-called trilogue where the three of us, so the Commission, the Parliament and the Council, discuss together to find common ground and to finally get the act adopted. So everything I will be telling you now is indeed about what the Commission proposed, but I will also tell you some things about things which are controversially discussed in the other institutions. So first, why are we regulating AI? We proudly tell everybody, and we proudly tell in our press releases, that we are the first ones in the world to put forward a comprehensive horizontal regulatory approach. But that indeed could also lead to the question, is this really necessary since you're the first ones? There could have been somebody before if there was a necessity. So indeed, we believe that yes, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. The reason being that there are a number of features, the complexity, the opacity, the unpredictability, the autonomy, and the questions of the quality of the data, which make it not clear how certain results are achieved and which lead to some risks to safety and fundamental rights. And these risks actually are not entirely covered by current legislation. Now, indeed, we already have a lot of legislation in place. We have the fundamental rights, we have the data protection rules, we have consumer production rules, we have product safety rules. There are a number, but the specificities of AI make it difficult to enforce these existing rules. So this is where we believe that a tailored regulatory response is needed. And this tailored response indeed is our draft AI framework. Now, I start with telling you some of the basic principles we were following. So first of all, it follows the product harmonization legislation. That means that an artificial intelligence, when it is put on the European market, or when its results are used on the European market, at that point, it needs to comply with certain requirements I will come to later. So it is not on the individual user, but it is on the one who is developing the AI, who is providing the AI to comply with these requirements. With that, we want to protect the safety and the fundamental rights. The fundamental rights in a product legislation approach is quite a novelty. So far, this was mostly about the safety. Now, we don't want to regulate everything. We don't want to regulate the whole of artificial intelligence. We only want to regulate certain use cases where we believe that there is a very high risk, again, to safety and fundamental rights. So this is not about regulating a technology. It is about regulating certain uses of it. And with that, we want to create a global level playing field, meaning that the rules will apply to all artificial intelligence being used in Europe, independent from where it comes from. It is a horizontal act, which means that it covers all the sectors. We don't want to have individual acts for different sectors. There might be some specificities indeed afterwards when it comes to the implementation, but the principles, the requirements will apply to all different sectors. We have drafted this in coherence and complementarity with the already existing legislation. So for example, if the data protection rules already prohibit something, we will not touch upon that topic, but also complementarity in that we integrate our requirements into already existing procedures. I'll explain that in more detail later. Finally, the AI Act is innovation friendly. So it's not only that it goes hand in hand with the coordinated plan, as I said before, but also that there are some provisions, for example, about regulatory sandboxes. So how to experiment AI together with the regulator. So first of all, the definition of AI. And that so far in the discussions with the co-legislators, but also with stakeholders, is probably one of the most controversial points. What we did is we found our inspiration in the definition which was already put forward by the OECD, which is rather broad, and we were trying to put it into legal drafting. So a software that is developed with one or more of the techniques and approaches listed in Annex 1, which are machine learning, logic and knowledge-based and statistical approaches, and can, for a given set of human-defined objectives, generate outputs such as content, predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing the environments they interact with. We were trying to draft that as neutral as possible, and with these techniques in Annex 1, also to cover techniques which are not yet known or developed, because this Annex 1 could be easily changed, added, if this is necessary. As I said before, this is very controversial. There are a number of voices telling us this is much too broad, and in particular with statistical approaches, we do not really need to regulate that. And then there are also many voices telling us that this is not going to fly because we also need to include all the algorithmic decision making and everything else. So very controversial. At the end, we are somewhere in the middle, and this is definitely going to be an interesting topic, but probably we all know that whoever you ask would have a different definition for AI. Lucky to say, since I said before, we are having a risk-based approach, the definition is less important, but what is important, what we are considering to be high risk. So if you look at this pyramid, we have about 80% of all AI where we believe there is minimal or no risk. They are permitted without restrictions. We have a number of applications where we believe that there is only a risk which requires certain transparency, that people should be informed. We have the high-risk applications, which is the core of the regulation, and we have very few systems where we say that this is an unacceptable risk and they therefore should be prohibited. So to start with the absolute majority of systems where we don't believe that there is a risk, for the ones where there is no risk, what we recommend is the adoption of voluntary codes of conduct. So that would be interesting. That is something which is advised, but it's entirely on a voluntary basis. This also could be done on the basis of the work of the high-level expert group I was talking about before. Then we have the transparency requirements, which means that humans should be notified that they're interacting with an AI system. This is, for example, for chatbots, when they are confronted with emotion recognition or biometric categorization, or it means to put a label on deep fakes. Now, the core of the pyramid is the high-risk systems. The high-risk systems we defined clearly in two annexes. First of all, these are AI systems where the AI is an important safety component of an already regulated product. For example, we have the medical devices, we have machinery, we have indeed all the motor vehicles and airplanes and plenty of others. These systems, before they're being put on the market, already need to undergo a conformity assessment. And in this conformity assessment, the requirements of the AI Act would be integrated simply, no additional procedure. And then the second one, there are certain standalone AI systems where there is yet no regulation, so there's also no conformity assessment. And there we wrote down in the annex 8 different areas. But in these 8 areas you see on the slides, we also mentioned individual use cases. And it is only the individual use cases in the areas which are high risk. So we have biometric identification and categorization of natural persons. Therefore, now we would only have the identification as a use case, where we say this is high risk. Categorization for now would not be high risk, but at a later point, if there are applications which are judged to be risky, these could be added. That also against the background that there were some studies saying that you could now spot the sexual orientation of people or their political opinions just from their picture. Now, this is something which is completely underdeveloped yet. It's just that it appears in some articles. But for example, if such systems would become popular, would be employed, then it could be a question whether that would be added as a high-risk use case. We have the management and operation of critical infrastructure, for example, gas, water, electricity. We have education and vocational training. Here it's about the access to the training, but it is also about the monitoring of students. We have employment and workers management and access to self-employment. Here it is in particular about the recruitment algorithms, the recruitment tools, but also about the monitoring of employees or also self-employed drivers. We have the access to and enjoyment of essential private services and public services and benefits. Here we have, for example, the credit scoring, but we also have public benefits, so social welfare benefits. We have a number of applications in the field of law enforcement, for example, lie detectors or predictive policing, risk analysis, and also in migration, asylum, and border control management, where, for example, it is about the authenticity of travel papers and stuff. And finally, we have the administration of justice and democratic processes. So again, 8 fields, but only the use cases which are laid down in Annex 3 are really high risk and subject to the regulation. So Here you can see the requirements these high-risk AI systems need to comply with. First of all, the provider needs to establish and implement a risk management process, and that in light of the intended purpose of the system, a risk management and also a quality management process. Then the first requirement relates to the quality of the training data and the validation and testing data. So this needs to be relevant and representative, always for the given purpose, in order to avoid discrimination or undue bias. Then there is a requirement to establish documentation and design and logging features in order to enable the traceability and the auditability. There is a requirement to ensure a certain degree of transparency and to provide the users with the necessary information on how to use the system. One needs to ensure human oversight. These are measures built into the system or also to be implemented by the users. And finally, there is robustness, accuracy, and cyber security. Now, what we want to do is to translate these requirements into harmonized European standards. So with that, indeed, we want to facilitate the implementation of the AI Act. The preliminary work has already begun, and we are about to launch a mandate to the European standardization organizations. The standards then should be completed by the entry into force of the Act. And that means we believe that we hopefully have an adoption of the Act at the end of 2023. And from there would still be 2 years of a transition period. So by the end of 2025, we need these standards. In the standard making process, indeed, everybody can participate, all the companies can participate, and a standard becomes a harmonized European standard once it is published in the official journal of the European Union. When somebody uses then these European harmonized standards, this provides a presumption of conformity with the requirements, so no further assessments would be needed. Now, in case that there is a problem with the standards, they are not ready on time, or perhaps there are new developments that the standards are not relevant or for other reasons, then there could be common specifications to be adopted by the Commission, and there would be an involvement of all relevant bodies, sectorial experts, group stakeholders. And again, there is some presumption of conformity, but then providers would need to justify when they do not comply with the common specifications. For example, they have adopted equivalent solutions. Same indeed also for the standards. So how does this look in practice? So you have the pre-market conformity assessment. For AI, that is a safety component of products. You already have an existing third-party ex-ante conformity assessment, and there the requirements would be part of the assessment. For the other high-risk AI standalone systems, we believe that it is too complicated now to establish all the authorities to do a third-party conformity assessment. So what we are proposing is that companies do that, or providers do that, through internal checks, with the one exception of biometrics, which is highly controversial and where therefore there should be a third-party assessment. Now, this question whether there should be a third-party assessment or not for the standalone systems is also something highly controversial in the negotiations. We then have the registration for the self-standing AI in a new database. So all the systems need to register there. And we have post-market, the market surveillance, meaning we have market surveillance authorities. We have indeed human oversight monitoring by everybody. We have reporting systems for serious incidents. And if there are substantial changes to an AI system, then there should be a reassessment. So we have the obligations on the provider to have the quality management system, to have a risk management system, to draw up the technical documentation, to build in certain logging obligations, and to undergo the conformity assessment. Now, in case you are in Israel, and you will know that if you already were working with exporting products to Europe, which fall under the product safety legislation or also for other reasons, then you would need an authorized representative in Europe. And that person, that authorized representative, would take care of the conformity assessment. Then there is the if it's a third-party assessment. There is a registration in the database. Again, this could be the authorized representative. There is a CE marking to be affixed, and there is the post-market monitoring and the obligation to collaborate with the surveillance authorities. Now, the user also has a number of obligations, though not so many. Indeed, the user needs to operate the system in accordance with the instructions of use, to ensure human oversight where this is required, to monitor the operation for possible risks, to inform the provider or distributor about any serious incident, and indeed all the existing legal obligations. So for example, the data protection rules or consumer protection rules continue to apply. Now with that, we do have a life cycle approach, a life cycle obligations. So just to show you quickly the slide, I talked about everything, and most importantly, I think, is the new conformity assessment, really in case of a substantial modification, but it would only be a substantial modification. With that, I leave the high-risk systems. I quickly go to the ones which are prohibited. There are very few. So we're having two systems where it comes to subliminal manipulation resulting in physical or psychological harm, or the exploitation of children or mentally disabled persons, again, resulting in physical or psychological harm. We didn't add the economic harm because there we believe that this is also covered already by other legislation. Then we have the general purpose social scoring by public authorities. So here you really need to imagine something like the Chinese system, where there is an overall social scoring. And finally, we have the remote biometric identification for law enforcement purposes in publicly accessible spaces. And there we also have exceptions. I get to the biometrics with the next slide, where you can see that biometrics appear on all levels of the pyramid. So we have on the bottom authentication and verification. That's, for example, if I take my passport and I want to go to the airport, to the border control, and it is just verified whether I am the person carrying that passport. So there we don't see any risk, not for that, not if you deblock your phone, or if you go to the bank and there is an iris check in order to get the money from the cash point. This is something we are not willing to regulate. Then we have AI with specific transparency obligations. this is about emotional recognition and categorization systems. So there people should be aware that these systems are running. Now, this is also something which is relatively controversial in the negotiations, and there are a number of voices suggesting that this should be rather high risk. Then we have all remote biometric identification systems, which are high risk. Just to get back to the interplay between the two, the categorization and emotional recognition, if you have, for example, a recruitment system, which in the same time then running the interview will check your emotions, will perhaps categorize you because you have glasses or because you're sitting together with some books as more diligent for the jobs, then this system would be high risk, including indeed the emotional recognition and categorization system. And then both requirements would apply. So one should be informed and it would be high risk. So for the risk, all remote biometric identifications, independent from whether they are on a physical space or in the virtual space and independent from whom uses them, would be high risk. And then the unacceptable risk is really for the law enforcement purposes in publicly accessible spaces. And there are a number of exceptions for searching for searching for persons that have disappeared, like missing children, if there is a concrete threat of a terror attack, or also to search for people who have committed a serious crime. Under these limited circumstances, these systems are allowed, and then go back to the high risk category. So here we had the prohibitions. I said before, we also have a chapter on innovation. This is about regulatory sandboxes. So how companies together with the regulator can develop an AI that is in conformity with the rules, and also in particular with data protection rules. And we have the governance structure, where what we are proposing is a decentralized structure. So we have all the implementation at member state level. We already have the conformity assessment bodies. We have market surveillance authorities. They will do the enforcement. And at European level, there would be an artificial intelligence board with one member per member state, the data protection supervisor, and a representative from the Commission. The Commission would act as a secretariat, and this artificial intelligence board would be accompanied by an expert group, which is providing and helping with all the scientific evidence. Now, this is also a pretty controversial point in the negotiations, and interestingly enough, it is the member states and the parliament who have doubts on whether, not all of them, but some of them, whether there should be a more central enforcement, at least for important cases which have an impact on a number of member states. For the rest, the topics we can see now in the negotiations which are controversial. The Parliament very much wants to include general purpose AI. So this indeed is not currently included, because we always ask for the concrete purpose of an AI in order to say that this is high risk or not. But there are a number of voices who say that this needs to be included, so that there need to be some specific rules. This is something which also starts being shared by Council. So you can expect that general purpose AI probably in one or other form could be included in the Act. Then the Parliament is very strongly advocating for a more deterrence, protection of fundamental rights, in particular when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to biometrics, when it comes to employment and systems used on the labor market. And then also they want to see more provisions on legal redress, where we always said that this is already covered by other acts like the anti-discrimination rules or the data protection rules, and therefore we do not need to add it. But the Parliament believes that this is something where we need specific rules in the Act. Now, the Council, the Member States are more afraid of over-regulation, of the regulation hampering innovation, and also whether there is not a specific need of law enforcement authorities, so that we have too many use cases concerning the law enforcement authorities. And then there are some voices who even propose that everything dealing with biometrics and law enforcement authorities on a public level should go in a different chapter or into a different act. Now it is clear that AI used by public authorities, there are quite some voices saying this is something specific, but indeed it's not clear whether there should be stricter obligations or less strict obligations. Both agree that there should be done something with the definition, but as I said before, it is not clear in what direction that could go. And then also governance and enforcement is discussed in both in Parliament and in Council, and there we are expecting some changes. And with that, I would like to thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Irina, for a very comprehensive overview of the regulation, the proposed regulation, and the rationale behind it, and where it stands right now. We really, really appreciate it. And it's, I think, very interesting for many of the companies that are with us today. I invite people to write questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom so that we can answer them. And in the meantime, I think one of my questions would be a little bit more about the post-market surveillance part of what would, I mean, how would that work, and what are the responsibilities of the companies in providing information for that part to make sure that they comply with the regulation as it is right now.
So for the market surveillance, so normally they always would have undergone the conformity assessment before, which means that there needs to be a very concrete reason to get in touch with the market surveillance authorities. One of the reasons could indeed be that there are some incidents, like to take the most drastic example, the self-driving car does crazy things. So you observe things are happening, and then indeed you need to get in touch with them. The other thing is that the surveillance authority might get in touch with you because, for example, there is a complaint. And then they would ask you, depending on the type of the complaint, indeed it would be the user or the provider. If it is the user can ask certain things then to the provider. And this is the reason for all the logging features and everything and all the requirements, then to find out what possibly has happened and whether it is something specific to the AI or not. So then the market surveillance authority would get in touch with whoever is relevant. What is important is that we are not planning on establishing for all the products which are already regulated new authorities, but the ones dealing now, let's say, with toys or with cars or whatever it is, they would also be in charge of that question. Which means that they need a bit of additional know-how on AI, but they already know the product.
Okay, that creating a lot of job opportunities also, I assume, in a few of the agencies. So I'm going to read a first question that we have in the Q&A section. First question is, do you expect national security organizations to be excluded, similarly to military uses?
So it is not about the organizations to be excluded, but it is about the uses to be excluded. And indeed, national security is something which per se is excluded from the scope of the European works. So Europe just has no right to interfere with national security, which means that any AI which serves purposes of national security, we cannot regulate. We are not allowed to do so. Now, indeed, there were voices in the negotiations who said that we should make that more clear. We had not put it in the first draft for the simple reason that it was so crystal clear that anyway, we are not allowed to do something. But now in the next draft by the presidency, there is going to be something in repeating it. The interesting question on that is the definition of national security, because we are having a number of judgments from the European Court, and there they clearly say that national security really is something which goes to the foundations of the state, so to democracy, rule of law. But let's say it's not that you can define this very broadly. So it's not that any criminal offense goes to national security. Or also if now I start running around with a knife saying, I hate, I don't know what, woman like me, that also is not necessarily national security. And that indeed is something where the security authorities are currently struggling a bit, and where there are some discussions whether there should be a broader exemption for national security, because this has been quite narrowly defined by the European Court of Justice.
Okay, thank you. Lena, I know you have one question before I move to the rest of the questions that are in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, Neta. I wanted just to make sure, again, because you referred to the issue of conformity assessment, and well, of course, I was mainly thinking about Israeli exporters. And if you could clarify again the cases where they would need to undergo through conformity assessment vis-a-vis the option of declaration. I assume that depends on the product, so like for medical devices, etc. But just to make sure if that is absolutely the same, or is there kind of an AI aspect that might change kind of the route that they would need to undergo?
So now what I'm saying now is our proposal, and this is also something where there are a number of voices who want to change that. What we are proposing is that all the products where already now we have a conformity assessment, which is basically the safety component of really products which are, you can look at them, it's in Annex 2 of the Act, they're all individually listed. And there we already have an existing conformity assessment. And there the AI part would be integrated into the existing assessment. And there are also already the bodies running the conformity assessment. So we will be planning indeed some training measures and things to get them up also to be able to do this AI part, but it will be an integral part of the assessment, the same way the AI is an integral part of the product. And then we are having this other Annex 3 where the AI is standalone. So this is mostly algorithms. This is mostly like software only. And at this point, there is no regulation on product safety, which means there is no conformity assessment at all, which means there's also not a body doing it. And what we are proposing here, and this is the controversial part, is that the companies will do a self-assessment. So that we will not within a short period of time build up all the authorities, but here all the companies should be doing a self-assessment, with the one exception of everything linked to biometrics, but all the others. So that is the proposal, and there would be special rules for all the applications in the field of law enforcement. That adds a bit to the security question, how to do this and which authorities could do the market surveillance and about confidentiality and everything. But it would be a self-assessment also for those.
Thank you. I'm moving on to the next question that we have in the Q&A. Do limitations apply the same when data is collected without specific user information, such as name, address, etc., other than device identifiers, only IP or device ID, for example?
Wait, let me read the question to you. When the data is collected without specific user information, other than device. If I understand the question well, this is more in the field of the data protection rules. Now, what is important indeed is that, so this looks like there is no personal data involved, and you cannot trace it back to somebody. Then under the data protection rules, you have very different rules, and that means also for the AI, when you want to develop it, you have more possibilities because you're not going to be in breach of the data protection rules. So there it is relevant. So for example, for the question, do I need a sandbox or not? But then it's always the question, can you still trace the data back to a given person? Now, you still would have the requirements because also this data could be biased or something. So we always use the examples of the recruitment algorithms, which is a bit banal, but like for certain jobs, there were always only men or women applying and taken. So the algorithm might very well kick out the other sex and just believe that that person is not appropriate for a given job. Now, here it would not help that you have not the personal data as long as you have a sex there. I hope I understood well, and this replies to the question.
Okay, well, I invite Merab, if you didn't understand, to clarify in a second. And I think she has here a second question. Do limitations apply the same when using the data for internal usage purposes? I think it's in continuation to what you just explained. So I don't know if that changes anything that you've said. And then the next question is, when do you expect the next draft to be released? Meaning, where are we in the trilogues, and what would the next step be?
Unfortunately, we're far away from the trilogues. So the European Parliament put forward, we have 7 committees involved, which is a lot. And we have 2 lead committees, the other 5 are giving opinions. They put forward a first report with draft amendments in April. And now all the other members of Parliament can propose amendments. The deadline for that is June. And then they will start discussing the amendments. There will be also the different committees proposing other amendments. And we expect, or they scheduled a vote for November that the Parliament has a position. In the Council, there was a first report on Articles 1 to 8 by the Slovenian presidency at the end of last year. You know that we always have a presidency for 6 months, then the next one comes. So we are now under the French presidency. and they will discuss a progress report in the council with the ministers next week. And they will put forward a first overall text, a first compromise text before the end of the presidency. So this should be before the end of June. And then we have the Czech presidency following. They have a very ambitious schedule. So they want to have a debate on some fundamental questions where there is disagreement, and then come very quickly on the basis of that debate with a second compromise text. And also the Czech presidency would like to have agreement for the council in the beginning of December. In that case, before Christmas, the trialogue could start. What we are saying now, but that's really reading the crystal ball, probably the trilogues would take about a year, which means that then we would be at the end of 2023 to find agreement. But as I said before, this is a bit of crystal ball.
Yeah, indeed. These processes tend to take a while, and then there are always unforeseen circumstances in these issues as well. Are there any other questions from the attendees or from Lena or anyone else before we conclude?
Perhaps just a short question, which might be non-relevant. Please feel free to respond. So we see quite a lot of digital regulation lately. So AI is one very important direction, and of course we're not going now to discuss in details the others, but we have seen the Data Governance Act and the other work in the digital field. So I was wondering, in those processes, is there any specific tool or legislation that you see as relevant or somehow interlinked to the AI regulation?
I think they are all interlinked. So with the Data Act, indeed, and we want to also to create the appropriate conditions again for AI to flourish. And you know that there are data lakes and there are possibilities of data sharing, and really the wish, because now we always say when we do the analysis of what we have in Europe, we say, well, we are so strong in industry and we have all the industrial data. So this is something we could greatly build on. But the truth is that companies are very reluctant to share their data. And since many AI systems are much better when they're developed with a lot of data, or they're even impossible without data, it always depends on the system. This is a precondition, and this precondition we are trying to create with the Data Governance and the Data Act. So to have the intermediaries, to have the lakes, also like to make data now public. I think the Commission today put forward a lot of data also to be shared with everybody in order to develop AI. So this is very important. Now on the Digital Services and Digital Market Act, there are also a couple of links when you look at the work of the platforms. But this is, it's not like a precondition, but you have certain links, for example, when it comes to deep fakes, which is also something about misinformation. This is something we are having, this is something they are having, and they're indeed now in the negotiations. For us, we need to see that we get the complementarity. We don't want to do something they are already doing, but if there is a specific angle from the artificial intelligence perspective where we need to regulate, like the information of things, then we are proposing this. But when we were proposing the act, these others were not yet adopted. So there we're having a few points where there is an overlap. But in general, we really try to see it as a puzzle where all the elements fit into each other and are not overlapping.
Thank you. We have one final question, which I'm not sure we know the answer to, but it's, is there a substantial chance that the law will not be adopted after all? I think that might be wishful thinking on some part of the industry, but correct me if I'm wrong, Irina, that once the Commission and EU in general decides on one of these issues, some sort of legislation will pass. What it would include, this is what we will see in the next coming year or 2 years.
Can I say two things on that?
Of course. That's, I mean, I'm leaving it open to you.
So first of all, it's very interesting because when we started the whole story about putting forward legislation and discussing legislation, we got this kind of question very, very often. And there were many people like really questioning whether legislation is needed at all and why we are doing this. And over the last 2 years, this conversation has significantly changed. And it's interesting that in Europe, but also in other countries, the necessity of legislation is now much less questioned. First answer. Second answer, I'm afraid there is a fair chance because you know that we are living like in 5 years terms with the European Parliament, with the Commission. And if we don't have a solution in 2 years from now, so we have in 2024 in May, June, we have again Parliament elections, and there is a completely new Parliament taking up the elections. We risk staying with that file for a long, long time.
I guess it would be interesting. I think there's one final question, and then I'm leaving the floor to you for this.
If we still have time, yes. I was wondering if you could relate to the international cooperation. I mean, oftentimes we see the EU legislation and regulation, such as the GDPR, for example, you know, being the first kind of the model, and that is in a way kind of a building block or a way to, of course, softly or not so softly to influence trade partners of the EU, etc. Now, in the AI, it's a very special field because obviously there's a competition, and when we talk about, you know, global playing fields, etc. And I wonder whether within the European Union, when internally consulting and negotiating and talking to the industry, did you hear voices saying that, okay, you know, you have to balance and take into consideration that there are companies operating in countries that are not going to adopt anything like that or anything in that direction, without naming specific countries. But, you know, we know about very strong AI, you know, competition from some corners of the world where there are absolutely no such directions. So is the global, you know, leveling the playing field, is that something that is being discussed?
Yeah, I would even say nearly on a daily basis. Most of our discussions don't go without mentioning it, and it is discussed from the angle of European competitiveness. So like, don't make it impossible for us to export AI. But it is also discussed, and okay, this will enable us together with the coordinated plan to put a certain benchmark on ethics. Now, this sounds a bit colonial the way I'm saying it, but the truth is that we are discussing a lot internationally. We're discussing a lot in the international organizations, but also bilaterally. And we're also discussing a lot about standards. And for example, when it comes to biometrics, we're doing the standards together with ISO right now, which is not a European standardization organization. But it is our objective with what is called like-minded countries, which I find a weird word, but still, to work on this together and not to do something where then we have in Europe rules which are impossible for anybody else and which will be a barrier to international trade. But we really want to do this in a very soft way, and I believe also the requirements are pretty soft and very, very reasonable, and with the standards that easy implementation is really possible for everybody and could even be something like automatic.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who asked questions, and specifically, Irina, I want to thank you very, very much for the very informative presentation. I'm sure we still have a lot of questions, and things might be clearer as things progress between all the three institutions, but maybe might be questions even before that people might want to raise. If so, I will be happy to pass those along to you and see whether we can provide more answers if it should be necessary. But I really want to thank you for your participation today. It was very informative and very interesting. And as I said in the beginning, in my opening remarks, we will be sending the presentation to all the attendees. So if they have any things that they missed or they want to go over again, they would have that opportunity to do that. Thank you, Lena, also for your participation and your questions and the discussion. And I want to thank everybody who attended and also my team for helping organize. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.